So let's look at polishing up UMG, so making our UI substantially better. At the moment, if I click play, that's what we have. And it's not really that pretty. Really what we want to do is make sure that anything that's in there has like a nice level of polish. So what I'm going to go about doing is setting up a main menu that actually looks reasonably good. So this time around, I want you to go to your assets folder and create a new subfolder. So I'm going to right click, new folder. I'm going to call this UI, and I'm going to import these from my textures UI folder. So both of these, just drag them in and import them. Now you can see that we've got two textures here. One is the back plate, so that's what we're going to have for the core of the main menu, and the other section is simply the logo itself. And I want you to double click on each of these and set the texture group to be UI. Save. Double click, UI, save. So now that that's good, let's go to Blueprints, and I'm going to open up the main menu. Now, the first way that people would think of adding a backplate to this would be to make sure that, they could just drag an image and hope that it all works. However, that's not actually a good way to do this. If I was to drag in an image and just drop it there, and I was to set the image to be the backplate, even if I checked size to content and ramped the size of this thing up, it's not a good way to handle this. And the reason being is that according to the screen resolution and everything else, it's going to resize itself in different ways. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's say I put this here and I set this up so that, the scale was reasonably close to what I had, and I just popped that there. If I was to change the screen to, say, an iPhone, it would now be all the way over here. If I was to change it to a MacBook, it would be sitting here. So different screen sizes have different consequences for where it's going to end up. And the way for us to fix that is to initially, I'm going to drag this so that the Y's kind of match. At which point I'm going to go to this and I'm going to set the anchor to be this one just here. Now I can see that this isn't correctly scaled, but that's okay. What I need to do is tell it that the position offset for X is equal to 0, which will position this left-hand side of it perfectly with the middle. At which point, if I go down to my alignment and I say X is equal to 0.5, this will now automatically put this in the middle, which is nice. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is you can see that we have offset top and we have offset bottom, and I've just zeroed out both of those values. Now the next thing to get this working is to right click on this and go to wrap with and set the wrap width to be a scale box. Now a scale box is fantastic because essentially what it lets us do is tell it to automatically fill the y-axis wherever it can and then scale the x-axis accordingly. And to do that, what we need to do is under vertical alignment, I'm going to click on this button here that says vertically align the fill, and I'll show you what that looks like. If I was to go screen size and change it to something that was in portrait, you can see that the menu is now stretching all the way to the top. However, it does have another issue, and that other issue is that this section here is not being correctly stretched accordingly. Notice how the x-axis is quite thin and that's not actually circular, it's more of an oval. So for us to fix that, all we need to do is go to our scale box, and under here where it says stretch scale to fit, we just tell it to scale to fit the y-axis. And now you can see that the x and the y are kept in line with one another, and it looks a lot nicer no matter the screen size. So if I change the screen size to any other device, that's always going to look reasonably consistent. So next up, what we need to do is get our scale box. I'm just going to drag it to the top here so that it's the backing. But it's time for us to look at UMG animations. So for a UMG animation, we're going to create a logo that upon launching is going to resize itself onto the screen. So let's look at how to go about doing that. First off, I'm going to get rid of this pinball game text because we're going to be replacing this with an actual logo. So I'm going to delete this, and instead I'm going to drag in an image, and I'm going to get this image and I'm going to tell it that the anchor point is going to be based off of the top center because that's always where I want the logo to end up. And I'm going to tell the brush to have an image that is the logo. And I can type in the word logo for us to find it. You'll notice that, it's automatically kind of done this. A nice way for us to handle this is I can go size to content, and you can see this will automatically pick up the size. The alternative is, instead of doing size to content, I can just tell it that the size X and size Y are given values. So as long as I make sure those are square, we should end up with something that looks like what we want. Now for this, I kind of want to have this sitting about here. So it's going to kind of sit a little off-centered, and then we'll eventually have the play button down here and a full high scores list. 500 by 500 looks okay. I might up it to something that's a bit easier to work out a downsampled version. So I've changed it to 512 purely because the texture itself is a 2048 by 2048, and if I divide that number by 4, which is a nice clean value, I get 512, which creates a slightly nicer image when we've made it smaller. So I've put it there as a 512, at which point I'm going to go ahead and quickly animate this to appear, and then we'll start looking at fixing up the play button and the high scores button. So initially what I need to do is I need to get this image and I need to add an animation for it. So the best way to think of animations is set your initial scene up as to how you want it to end up as, and then when you go to create an animation, you kind of work backwards from that. So I've clicked on the Unreal Pinball, and I'm now going to add an animation, and I'm going to call this new animation Intro. Now within this, I could theoretically change any of the values for any of the assets that are currently in the scene. An animation isn't tied to a single section, like it could be the entire menu is animated in different ways. For the time being, I'm just going to focus on this logo though. So to do that, what I need to do is I need to add the image. Now you'll notice that at the moment we haven't really been naming any of these things very well. So I'm going to go back to this image and I'm going to click F2, and I'm just going to rename this to be menu logo. So now when I go back to add, you'll notice that we have menu logo as an option. So by adding menu logo here, I can now click on this add track button. And the track that we want is the transformation track. So if I click on that, what I'm actually able to do is set up keyframes that allow me to change its transformation values, so its translation, rotation, scale, and the shear. We're going to ignore shear for the time being. I can change those on the fly to do different things, and I'll show you what that means. If I was, for instance, to go to my scale, and I was to select up here at about the 1 second mark, and I was to add a keyframe, you can see that it's added the 2 keyframes here. So what we're going to be doing here is initially we have 2 values of 1 and 1. I'm just going to drag this all the way back to this initial frame, and I'm going to select this, and I'm just going to set this value to 0 and this value to 0 as well. And you'll notice that now, if I was to play this animation, the pinball logo just goes from 0 scale to scaling up to create something like that. Now, it's a good idea when you're doing these kind of things to kind of add a little bit of a pop. So to do that, all I'm going to do is at this point, so at 0.9 seconds in, I'm actually going to set the scale to be 1.2 and 1.2. And what this means is it kind of gets big and then goes small again. So that's initially what we've got, and this is already set to be a cubic interpolation, which is nice. So that gives it a nice kind of smooth in, smooth out. But if you wanted to, you could set it to linear as well, which is another common way of interpolating variables. I'm also going to get these 2 keyframes, and I'm just going to kind of move them across just a little bit so I can position them to get kind of a quicker pop. Actually, I might move this way instead. Yeah, that looks a lot nicer. So you can see it goes pop and then comes back down. Great. So that's our initial intro. And if I was to hit compile, save, we wouldn't see that when we played the asset initially. And I'll show you why. So if I go to my pinball game and I hit play, you can see that we had the menu and we had the logo, but nothing played. And the reason for that is rather simple. If I go to my graph, and I go to the section that says construct. Construct is kind of like the widget version of begin play. So if I get the construct and I was to get the animation reference, you can see it's over here, and drag that in. So I get that. I can now call play animation. And if I was to plug this in, compile, save, you can see that on launch, it just played the intro animation, and we had something rather nice. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this. If I wanted to, for instance, I could go about setting up the main menu to have the middle sections slide in, scale in, do whatever wonderful things we wanted. But for the time being, I kind of just wanted that logo to be correct. That's all we need to kind of get some basic animation. If I wanted to go to my intro, I'm able to add new assets to this, so I could get the background plate and add things there too. And I probably will do that once everything is completely 100% set up as a final push, but I'm going to hold off for just the time being. Instead, next we're going to focus on adding fonts. So instead of using this standard Unreal Engine Roboto font, we're going to put in something new. And I should stress here that one of the most telltale signs that a project is still in the prototyping phase is that all of the fonts are still set to Roboto. It's just one of those things you start picking the more you see Unreal Engine projects. So it's a good idea to kind of give it a nice level of polish to kind of move away from that as early as you can. So we're going to look at that for the next lesson.